An elderly woman quietly boards a flight, settling into her seat with the grace of someone who has traveled many times before. But when a young flight attendant refuses to serve her properly, she has no idea who she's dealing with. What happens next will not only shock her but could alter the fate of the entire airline. Before we dive into the story, comment below to let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy this tale. On a warm, sunny afternoon, Flight 347 was scheduled to depart from Atlanta's bustling Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. The crew had completed their final checks, and passengers had boarded with anticipation of their journey to New York. Among them was a calm, dignified elderly woman named Mrs. Evelyn Harper. She wore a simple outfit, with her silver hair neatly tied in a bun, and carried a small bag by her side. To most of the passengers, she appeared like just another elderly traveler on her way to visit family, but for the flight crew, she was just another face in the crowd. At least, that's what they thought. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants began their usual in-flight duties. They strolled down the aisles offering drinks, snacks, and checking on the comfort of the passengers. One young attendant, Jessica, noticed Mrs. Harper sitting quietly near the back of the plane. The elderly woman was in the aisle seat, her window shade up, gazing thoughtfully out at the clouds. It didn't seem like she was paying much attention, but something about her posture caught Jessica's eye. Mrs. Harper appeared a bit uncomfortable. Her seat didn't recline, and the row next to her had a small child kicking her seat incessantly. When Jessica passed by again, she stopped and gently tapped Mrs. Harper on the shoulder. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jessica said, her voice polite yet slightly curt. "Would you mind switching seats? That child is causing a disruption, and we need to keep things orderly." Mrs. Harper looked up slowly, taken aback by the sudden request. She had flown countless times and understood the occasional discomfort that came with air travel, but something about Jessica's tone rubbed her the wrong way. "I'm fine here, thank you," Mrs. Harper responded softly, her voice calm and steady. Jessica, however, didn't like the answer. She could have let it go, but something about Mrs. Harper's defiance stirred her impatience. She stood there, arms crossed, glaring down at the elderly woman. "I'm not sure you understand, ma'am," Jessica continued, her voice now tinged with annoyance. "We need to maintain peace on the flight, and if you're uncomfortable, it would be easier for everyone if you just moved." She glanced at the disruptive child in the next row, then back at Mrs. Harper. "I can't have passengers causing a fuss." Mrs. Harper's face remained calm. Her heartbeat quickened slightly, but she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she simply nodded politely, her eyes not leaving Jessica's. "I appreciate your concern, young lady, but I've been flying for many years and I know how to handle a little discomfort." Jessica's frustration grew, but she didn't want to escalate things further. Without saying another word, she turned and walked away, giving Mrs. Harper a dismissive glance as she muttered something under her breath. Some people think they can do whatever they want. The rest of the flight proceeded, but an uneasy tension lingered in the air. Passengers who had overheard the exchange began whispering among themselves. Some were uncomfortable with Jessica's harsh tone toward the elderly woman, while others shrugged it off as a misunderstanding. But one thing was clear: Mrs. Harper was no ordinary passenger, and her presence carried more weight than anyone realized. Jessica, however, had no idea that the incident was far from over. What she didn't know was that Mrs. Harper was more than just a quiet elderly woman. She was a person of immense power, and soon Jessica would find out just how wrong she had been in underestimating her. A few minutes later, as Jessica continued her rounds delivering drinks, the discomfort from her earlier interaction with Mrs. Harper gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation was different. When she passed by Mrs. Harper again, the elderly woman was still seated quietly, hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the clouds outside the window. Jessica paused, trying to mask her earlier frustration. "Are you sure you're all right, ma'am?" she asked, her tone now softer. Mrs. Harper turned her head slowly, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," she replied, her voice composed and serene. Jessica nodded but felt the weight of an invisible tension hanging in the air. Just as she was about to move on, Mrs. Harper spoke again, her voice gentle yet firm. "I would like to speak to the captain when you have a moment." The request was unusual. It wasn't every day that a passenger asked to speak to the captain, especially for something as trivial as a seat change. She glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Mrs. Harper. "Are you sure, ma'am?" "I'm certain we can resolve this here," Jessica said, trying to steer the conversation away from involving the captain. Mrs. Harper's expression remained unwavering. "I'd prefer to speak to the captain," she insisted, her tone more resolute this time. Jessica hesitated. She had been trained to handle most issues without bothering the captain, but something about Mrs. Harper's calm insistence made her reconsider. There was no way this would be a simple issue if the captain was involved. "All right," Jessica said, trying to avoid confrontation. "I'll see what I can do." Moments later, Jessica approached the captain, a tall, composed man named Captain Reynolds, and explained that a passenger wanted to speak with him. The captain raised an eyebrow in confusion but agreed to check it out. "Is everything all right back there?" he asked, unaware of any major issue. Jessica offered a vague response, attempting to downplay the situation. "It's just a small matter. I'm sure it won't take long." Captain Reynolds nodded, though his curiosity was evident. He began walking toward the back of the plane, and Jessica felt a wave of unease. Passengers were starting to notice. Some had seen the tension between Jessica and Mrs. Harper, and others were simply trying to figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper sat in her seat, calm as ever, radiating an air of quiet confidence. When the captain finally reached Mrs. Harper's seat, he greeted her politely, but his demeanor was now cautious. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, offering a warm smile. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." Mrs. Harper nodded. "Yes, I'd like to address a few concerns regarding the service on this flight." Captain Reynolds paused, sensing the gravity in her words. Jessica stood a few paces away, her anxiety rising. The atmosphere had shifted. This wasn't a simple complaint about a seat. Something more was happening here. Then, as the captain glanced down at Mrs. Harper's boarding pass to verify her identity, Jessica saw his expression change. He looked from the boarding pass to Mrs. Harper, then back again. "I see," he said, his voice lower than before. He turned to Jessica, his expression now serious. "Please excuse us for a moment." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She stood frozen in place as the captain led Mrs. Harper into a quiet conversation. What was going on? Why was the captain suddenly taking this so seriously? And why had he said, "I see"? After what felt like an eternity, Captain Reynolds returned to Jessica with a grave look on his face. "Jessica, I need you to step aside for a moment." Confused and apprehensive, Jessica followed him to the galley at the front of the plane. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Captain Reynolds didn't waste any time. "Do you know who that woman is?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The elderly woman?" Jessica asked, her mind racing. "She's just a passenger." "Why?" Captain Reynolds ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "She's Evelyn Harper, the owner of this airline." The words hit Jessica like a thunderbolt. The woman she had dismissed as just another elderly traveler was the very owner of the airline she worked for. I'm sorry, what?" Jessica stammered, disbelief written all over her face. Captain Reynolds exhaled deeply. "She doesn't publicize it. She doesn't flaunt it. But Evelyn Harper owns this airline. This airline." Jessica felt a cold rush of panic flood her body. The woman she had treated so harshly could shut down the airline, fire her on the spot, or worse, destroy her career with one word. She replayed the earlier interaction, the way she had spoken to Mrs. Harper with impatience and condescension. "I didn't know," Jessica whispered, her voice small, full of regret. "That's the problem," Captain Reynolds replied sharply. "You didn't know. And now you've made a mess of things. You embarrassed her in front of the passengers." Jessica stood there, her face flushed with shame. She had always prided herself on being a professional. She had always believed she could handle any situation, but she had failed miserably this time. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice faltering. "I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't," Captain Reynolds interrupted, his tone softening. "But you need to understand something, Jessica. Respect isn't just about doing your job. It's about how you treat people, no matter who they are. Mrs. Harper doesn't demand respect because of her wealth or status. She demands it because she's earned it. Jessica stood in silence, her mind reeling. She wanted to apologize, to make things right, but deep down she knew it was too late. She had crossed a line. Captain Reynolds gave a final, I don't know what will happen next, but I suggest you stay out of Mrs. Harper's way for the rest of the flight, and you better pray she doesn't take this up with someone higher up when we land. With that, he turned and walked back toward the main cabin, leaving Jessica standing in the galley, stunned. As the flight continued, Jessica's thoughts swirled. She couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Harper, about how quiet, composed, and powerful she had seemed. And now, Jessica realized that her careless actions might lead to something far bigger than she ever expected. Mrs. Harper wasn't a woman to be taken lightly. As Jessica passed Mrs. Harper's seat again, she noticed a subtle change. The elderly woman was no longer gazing out the window with a faraway look. Instead, her hands were neatly folded in her lap, her eyes locked onto the pages of the magazine in front of her. A wave of guilt washed over Jessica, and her throat tightened. She had treated Mrs. Harper poorly, assuming far too much about her, and now she had to face the consequences. What could she possibly say to make up for her actions? "Ma'am," Jessica began hesitantly, her voice wavering. I just want to apologize for earlier. I didn't know who you were, and I was out of line." She could barely meet Mrs. Harper's gaze, ashamed. "I'm really sorry." For a moment, Mrs. Harper didn't respond. She simply turned a page in her magazine, her face unreadable. Jessica's heart sank. Had her apology been too late? Perhaps it wasn't enough to undo the hurt she had caused. Just when she feared Mrs. Harper might ignore her completely, the elderly woman's calm voice broke through the silence. "I don't expect apologies from those who don't understand the impact of their actions," she said, her tone soft but filled with quiet wisdom. "But I do hope you'll learn from this and treat others with respect, regardless of their age, appearance, or status." Jessica nodded, her throat tightening. "I will," she promised, her voice filled with sincerity. "I really will." There was a long pause before Mrs. Harper finally raised her eyes from her magazine. Her gaze was steady, piercing yet kind. "I believe you will," she said, her tone softer now, almost maternal. "But don't forget this. True respect isn't something that's earned through titles or appearances. It's something you show every single day, to everyone, without exception." Jessica stood there, silent, processing the gravity of Mrs. Harper's words. She had expected anger, a scolding perhaps, but what Mrs. Harper offered her was something deeper, a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The elderly woman didn't shout, didn't chastise her. Instead, she imparted a quiet, profound wisdom that Jessica would never forget. Before Jessica could speak again, the captain approached, his expression unreadable. He glanced briefly at Jessica, then at Mrs. Harper, before turning his attention to the aisle. "Mrs. Harper," Captain Reynolds said with a respectful nod, "we'll be landing in about 30 minutes. Is there anything else I can do for you before we arrive?" Mrs. Harper smiled politely, a small, courteous gesture. "No, Captain. I believe I've had everything I need." With that, Captain Reynolds turned and walked back toward the front of the plane, leaving Jessica standing next to Mrs. Harper, her mind still heavy with the earlier conversation. The flight was nearing its end, but Jessica felt an unshakable sense that something monumental was yet to come. The weight of her apology still lingered, but there was a looming sense of something more, something she couldn't yet see, but felt deep inside. As the plane began its descent, Jessica felt the tight knot in her stomach return. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Would Mrs. Harper let the incident slide? Or was there more in store, something that would make her truly understand the gravity of her mistake? When the plane finally touched down in New York, the usual buzz of excitement filled the air. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, grabbed their bags, and began preparing for the long walk through the terminal. But for Jessica, there was no sense of celebration. Her thoughts were consumed by the events of the flight, the conversation with Captain Reynolds, the apology to Mrs. Harper. Had it been enough? Was it even enough to make things right? As the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign clicked off, Jessica began to move down the aisle to assist with disembarking passengers. But as she passed Mrs. Harper's seat, she noticed something different. The elderly woman wasn't in her seat anymore. Mrs. Harper had already stood up, her small carry-on bag in hand, making her way toward the front of the plane. For a moment, Jessica thought she might be imagining things. But then, Mrs. Harper caught her eye. She smiled, though it wasn't the warm, forgiving smile Jessica had hoped for. No, it was a smile with an edge to it. "Jessica," Mrs. Harper said, her voice low but deliberate, stopping directly in front of her. "I hope you've learned your lesson." Jessica's stomach churned. How did Mrs. Harper know her name? Had she been watching her the entire time? "I believe in second chances," Mrs. Harper continued, her voice calm but with quiet power. "But I also believe in accountability, and what you've done here today will not be overlooked." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She had expected a simple resolution, an apology accepted, maybe a quiet acknowledgement that things were fine. But Mrs. Harper wasn't letting this go. She was taking it to another level, and Jessica knew exactly what that meant. Consequences. Real, unavoidable consequences. Before Jessica could respond, Mrs. Harper raised her hand, signaling her to remain silent. "Apologies," she said slowly. "Don't always undo harm. It's the decision-makers at the top who will determine your future now. They will see this, and trust me, they take respect very seriously." With those final words, Mrs. Harper turned and walked toward the front of the plane, her steps measured, her back straight. Jessica stood frozen in place, the blood draining from her face. The moment she had dreaded was now upon her, and she had no idea how to make things right. Her apology had been the first step, but it seemed far from enough. Captain Reynolds appeared beside her, his expression unreadable. "Jessica," he said quietly, his voice calm but filled with an underlying tension. "I suggest you sit tight for now. Mrs. Harper is having a private conversation with senior staff. She's not angry, but she's not letting this go either." Jessica nodded, feeling her heart sink deeper into her chest. Her mistake had already cost her. She could feel it in the way the crew was treating her, the way Mrs. Harper had subtly shifted the entire dynamic. It was clear that her actions had set something in motion, a chain of events that she couldn't control. As the final passengers trickled off the plane, Jessica remained in her seat, her mind racing with the uncertainty of what was to come. Would she be fired? Would she be disciplined? But when Captain Reynolds returned with the senior flight manager, the reality hit her hard. Mrs. Harper had already escalated the situation. She wasn't just a quiet passenger who would let this slide. No, Mrs. Harper had the power to influence decisions that would affect Jessica's career in ways she couldn't yet fathom. As the door to the gate opened, Jessica was met with the sight of Mrs. Harper standing before her, flanked by two airline executives. Their expressions were unreadable, their stance rigid. Mrs. Harper turned slowly toward Jessica, her eyes sharp and calculating, like a judge preparing to issue a verdict. "Jessica," she said calmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "I trust you understand the gravity of what happened today." Jessica could barely speak, but she managed to nod. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." Mrs. Harper studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Good, because I don't expect you to make the same mistake again. Respect, integrity, and humility are non-negotiable in this airline, and in life." Jessica's throat tightened, and her stomach dropped. Mrs. Harper wasn't shouting. She wasn't even angry. But the calm, unyielding tone in her voice left Jessica feeling smaller than she ever had before. She had crossed a line, and now the price for that mistake was about to be paid. As Mrs. Harper turned to speak with the executives, Jessica's mind reeled. This was no longer just about a single incident. This was about her future, her career, and the standards she had failed to uphold. And with that, Jessica knew her life at the airline would never be the same. The lesson she had learned, the painful, hard lesson, would stay with her for as long as she lived. "That's the right attitude," Captain Reynolds said. "Mrs. Harper is tough but fair. If you show her you've learned, she'll respect that." A flicker of hope sparked in Jessica. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was a chance to turn things around. But deep down, doubt lingered. What would Mrs. Harper decide? Would this be her second chance or the end of her time with the airline? Over the next few days, Jessica felt like a ghost, going through the motions of her job, but unable to escape the consequences of her mistake. Every mention of Mrs. Harper's name made her stomach tighten. Her mistake was now part of the company's history. When Captain Reynolds pulled her aside before her next flight, his words were both relieving and terrifying. "Mrs. Harper wants to know how you're doing," he said. "She's keeping an eye on your progress." Jessica's heart raced. "She's not going to fire me, is she?" "Not yet," he said. "But she's watching. This is your chance to prove yourself." As the flight continued, Jessica couldn't focus. She kept thinking about Mrs. Harper's
Then, during the
looming
flight,
judgment. An email from HR arrived. A meeting with Mrs. Harper. The subject line said it all. Follow up on incident. Jessica felt both dread and hope. Mrs. Harper hadn't closed the door completely, but this meeting could decide her future. The next day, Jessica stood nervously in the sleek corporate office lobby, waiting for the moment that would determine her future. When Mrs. Harper arrived, she was calm and authoritative. "I trust you're ready for this conversation," she said. Jessica nodded, her nerves building. In the private conference room, Mrs. Harper was direct. "You made a mistake, Jessica, but what I care about is how you're going to handle it." "I understand, ma'am," Jessica replied. "I made an assumption. I didn't show the respect you deserve, and I regret it. I'm here to prove I've learned." Mrs. Harper listened, her gaze steady. "This isn't just about apologies. It's about whether you can earn respect, not because of your position, but because of how you treat others." Jessica felt her voice falter, but she found her strength. "I understand now. Respect is earned through actions, not just words." Mrs. Harper nodded. "Good, but words won't prove anything. I'm giving you a chance. Show me you can handle the responsibility." "I won't let you down," Jessica said earnestly. Mrs. Harper stood and looked at her one last time. "I'll be watching, not to punish you, but because I believe people can change if they want to." As Mrs. Harper left, Jessica felt a shift within herself. This wasn't just a chance to redeem herself. It was an opportunity to prove she had truly learned. With renewed determination, Jessica knew she wouldn't waste this second chance. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to earn her place, one step at a time.